First, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. They were not love letters, but Lieutenant Cross was hoping, so he kept them folded in plastic at the bottom of his rucksack. In the late afternoon, after a day's march, he would dig his foxhole, wash his hands under a canteen, unwrap the letters, hold them with the tips of his fingers, and spend the last hour of light pretending. He would imagine romantic camping trips into the White Mountains in New Hampshire. He would sometimes taste the envelope flaps, knowing her tongue had been there. More than anything, he wanted Martha to love him, as he loved her, but the letters were mostly chatty, elusive on the matter of love. She was a virgin, he was almost sure. She was an English major at Mount Sebastian, and she wrote beautifully about her professors and roommates and midterm exams, about her respect for Chaucer and her great affection for Virginia Woolf. She often quoted lines of poetry. She never mentioned the war, except to say, "Jimmy, take care of yourself." The letters weighed 4 ounces. They were signed, Love, Martha. But Lieutenant Cross understood that love was only a way of signing and did not mean what he sometimes pretended it meant. At dusk, he would carefully return the letters to his rucksack. Slowly, a bit distracted, he would carefully return the letters to his rucksack. Slowly, a bit distracted, he would get up and move among his men, checking the perimeter. Then at full dark, he would return to his hole and watch the night and wonder if Martha was a virgin. Virginia Woolf was a British novelist in 1882 to 1941 and author of A Room of One's Own, authored in 1929, which explores the difficulties that have inhibited women writers. Plural woman. Chaucer. Canterbury Tales, author Geoffrey Chaucer, in the parentheses, C period, 1343 to 1400, end of parentheses, comma, often hailed as the first English poet and the greatest before Shakespeare. Page 624. There's a photo of Tim O'Brien in Vietnam, C period, 1969 to 1970. The things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities, or near necessities, were P38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, matches, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. Together, these items weighed between 12 and 18 pounds, depending upon a man's habits or rate of metabolism. Henry Dobbins, who was a big man, carried extra rations. He was especially fond of canned peaches and heavy syrup over pound cake. Dave Jensen, who practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel-sized bars of soap he'd stolen on R&R in Sydney, Australia. R&R was rest and recuperation, or relaxation, leave, military acronym / slang. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside the village of Tan Cay in mid-April. By necessity, and because he was SOP, they all carried steel helmets that weighed 5 pounds, including the liner and camouflage cover. They carried the standard fatigue jackets and trousers. Very few carried underwear. On their feet, they carried jungle boots, 2.1 pounds, and Dave Jensen carried 3 pairs of socks and a can of Dr. Scholl's foot powder as a precaution against trench foot. 2. Flammable tablets used to heat rations. P-38 can openers, small can openers developed in 1942 and issued as part of the field rations of United States forces between World War II and the 1980s. Combat rations, canned meals for use in the field. See period 1940 to 1958. Military payment certificates, forms of currency used to pay United States military and some foreign countries from the end of World War II until the late 1970s. Standard operating procedure, which is SOP when abbreviated, which is another form of military acronym slash slang. Serious medical condition, which is trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to damp, cold, unsanitary conditions, was named because of its prevalence among soldiers serving in the trenches of World War II. Until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope, which for him was a necessity. Mitchell Sanders, the RTO, radio telephone operator, military acronym slash saying, carried condoms. Norman Booker carried a diary. Rat Kiley carried comic books. Kiowa, a devoted Baptist, carried an illustrated New Testament that had been presented to him by his father, who taught Sunday school in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. As a hedge against bad times, however, Kiowa also carried his grandmother's distrust of the white man, his grandfather's old hunting hatchet. Necessity dictated. Because the land was mined and booby-trapped, it was SOP for each man to carry a steel-centered, nylon-covered flak jacket, which weighed 6.7 pounds, but which, on hot days, seemed much heavier. Because you could die so quickly, each man carried at least one large compressed bandage, usually in a helmet for easy access. Because the nights were cold, and because the monsoons were wet, each carried a green plastic poncho that could be used as a raincoat or ground sheet or makeshift tent. With its quilted liner, the poncho weighed almost 2 pounds, but it was worth every ounce. In April, for instance, when Ted Lavender was shot, they used his poncho to wrap him up, then to carry him across the paddy, then to lift him into the chopper that took him away. They were called legs or grunts. To carry something was to hump it, as when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross humped his love for Martha up the hills and through the swamps. In its intransitive form, to hump meant to walk or to march, but it implied burdens far beyond the intransitive. Almost everyone humped photographs. In his wallet, Lieutenant Cross carried 2 photographs of Martha. The first was a Kodacolor snapshot signed Love, though he knew better. She stood against a brick wall. Her eyes were gray and neutral, her lips slightly open as she stared straight on at the camera. At night, sometimes Lieutenant Cross wondered who had taken the picture, because he knew she had boyfriends, because he loved her so much, and because he could see the shadow of the picture taker spreading out against the brick wall. The second photograph had been clipped from the 1968 Mount Sebastian yearbook. It was an action shot, women's volleyball, and Martha's was bent horizontal to the floor, reaching the palms of her hand in sharp focus, the tongue out, the expression frank and competitive. There was no visible sweat. She wore white gym shorts. Her legs, he thought, were almost certainly the legs of a virgin, dry and without hair. The left knee cocked and carrying her entire weight, which was just over 117 pounds. Lieutenant Cross remembered touching that left knee. A dark theater, he remembered, and the movie was Bonnie and Clyde, and Martha wore a tweed skirt. And during the final scene, when he touched her knee, she turned and looked at him in a sad, sober way that made him pull his hand back. But he would always remember. Usually swampy fields where rice is grown, a paddy, that is, when used without a direct object. First color film made by the Eastman Kodak Company, Kodacolor. C period 1942 to 1963. Oscar-winning film, 1967, in which Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway portrayed Depression-era outlaws Clyde Barrow, 1909 to 1934, and Bonnie Parker, 1910 to 1934. I believe that was in that order. Bonnie Clyde Barrow? No. Outlaws Clyde Barrow, 1909 to 1934, his date of birth and death, and Bonnie Parker, 1910 to 1934, and its graphic final scene, shot partly in slow motion. The couple dies in a hail of machine gun fire. But the one that says that is when used without a direct object. Huh. Okay, so it's after Patty. Intransitive form. Intransitive form, that is, when used without a direct object. Proceeding. We read page 625, now we're on page 626. The feel of tweed skirt. Oh, I'll start off from that line. A dark theater, he remembered, and the movie was Bonnie and Clyde, and Martha wore a tweed skirt, and during the final scene, when he touched her knee, she turned and looked at him in a sad, sober way that made him pull his hand back. But he would always remember the feel of the tweed skirt and the knee beneath it, and the sound of the gunfire that killed Bonnie and Clyde. How embarrassing it was. How slow and oppressive. He remembered kissing her goodnight at the dorm door. Right then, he thought, he should have done something brave. He should have carried her up the stairs to her room and tied her to the bed and touched that left knee all night long. He should have risked it. Whenever he looked at the photographs, he thought of new things he should have done. What they carried was partly a function of rank, partly a field specialty. As a first lieutenant and platoon leader, Jimmy Cross carried a compass, maps, code books, binoculars, and a .45 caliber pistol that weighed 2.9 pounds fully loaded. He carried a strobe light and a responsibility for the lives of his men. As an RTO, Mitchell Sanders carried the PRC-25 radio, a killer 26 pounds with its battery. As a medic, Rat Kiley carried a canvas satchel filled with morphine and plasma and malaria tablets and surgical tape and comic books and all the things a medic must carry, including M&Ms for especially bad wounds, for a total weight of nearly 18 pounds. As a big man, therefore, a machine gunner, Henry Dobbins carried the M60, which weighed 23 pounds unloaded, but which was almost always loaded. In addition, Dobbins carried between 10 and 15 pounds of ammunition draped in belts across his chest and shoulders. As PFCs or Spec 4s, most of them were common grunts and carried the standard M16, not unloaded, the standard M16 gas operated assault rifle. The weapon weighed 7.5 pounds unloaded, 8.2 pounds with its full 20 round magazine. Depending on numerous factors, such as topography and psychology, the riflemen carried anywhere from 12 to 20 magazines, usually in cloth bandoliers, adding on another 8.4 pounds at minimum, 14 pounds at maximum. When it was available, they also carried M16 maintenance gear, rods and steel brushes, and swabs and tubes of LSA oil, all of which weighed about a pound. Among the grunts, some carried the M79 grenade launcher, 5.9 pounds unloaded, a reasonably light weapon except for the ammunition, which was heavy. A single round weighed 10 ounces. The typical load was 25 rounds, but Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried 34 rounds when he was shot and killed outside Tan K, and he went down under an exceptional burden. More than 20 pounds of ammunition, plus the flak jacket and helmet and rations and water and toilet paper and tranquilizers and all the rest, plus the unweighted fear. He was dead weight. There was no twitching or flopping. Kiowa, who saw it happen, said it was like watching a rock fall or a big sandbag or something. Just boom, then down. Not like the movies where the dead guy rolls around and does fancy spins and goes ass over, hyphen, to show we'll connect that next line to the next start of the next page, which is 627. The little things in the bottom of the page say, medics in Vietnam administered M&M's candies as a placebo to those so severely wounded that they wouldn't benefit from treatment. Those holding the rank of Specialist Force Class, which, remember 4S, the rank immediately above Private First Class, which is PFC abbreviated, military acronym / saying, rank between Private, PVT, and Lance Corporal, LCP. Altogether, those holding the rank of Specialist Force Class. Those holding the rank of Specialist Force Class, the rank immediately above Private First Class. Private First Class, rank between Private, PVT, and Lance Corporal, LCP. Military acronym / saying for either lubricant, small arms, or lubricant, semi-fluid, automatic weapons. Next page, 327. United States soldiers on search and destroy patrol in Vietnam, 1966. Shows a nice image. 627. Remember, we're going to start with the last line of 326 and proceed to 327. Kiowa, who saw it happen, said it was like watching a rock fall or a big sandbag or something. Just boom, then down. Not like the movies where the dead guy rolls around and does fancy spins and goes ass over. Tea kettle. Not like that, Kiowa said. The poor bastard just flat buck fell. Boom down. Nothing else. It was a bright morning in mid-April. Lieutenant Cross felt the pain. He blamed himself. They stripped off Lavender's canteens and ammo, all the heavy things, and Rat Kiley said the obvious. The guy's dead. And Mitchell Sanders used his radio to report one U.S. KIA and to request a chopper. Then they wrapped Lavender in his poncho. They carried him out to a dry paddy, established security, and sat smoking the dead man's dope until the chopper came. Lieutenant Cross kept to himself. He pictured Martha's smooth young face, thinking he loved her more than anything, more than his men. And now, Ted Lavender was dead because he loved her so much and could not stop thinking about her. When the dust-off arrived, they carried Lavender aboard. Afterward, they burned Tan K. They marched until dusk. then dug their holes, and that night, Kiowa kept explaining how you had to be there, how fast it was, how the poor guy just dropped like so much concrete. Boomed down, he said, like cement. In addition to the three standard weapons, the M60s, the M60, M16, and M79, they carried whatever presented itself, or whatever seemed appropriate as a means of killing or staying alive. They carried catch as catch can. At various times, in various situations, they carried M14s and CAR-15s and Swedish Ks and grease guns, and captured AK-47s and Chicoms and RPGs and Simonov carbines and black market Uzis and 38 caliber Smith & Wesson handguns and 66 millimeter laws and shotguns and silencers and blackjacks and bayonets and C4 plastic explosives. That was a line that was the end of 627, page 627, and went on to 628. Pretty extensive. Going back to 627, the last, or the little bottom section it clarifies is killed in action, KIA, which is a form of military acronym / slang. Medical evacuation helicopter, which is the dusk off, perhaps an acronym for dedicated, unhesitating service to our fighting forces. DUS, dust, OFF, off, not dusk. Kira carried his grandfather's feathered hatchet. Every third or fourth man carried a Claymore anti-personnel mine, 3.5 pounds with its firing device. They all carried fragmentation grenades, 14 ounces each. They all carried at least one M18 colored smoke grenade, 24 ounces. Some carried CS or tear gas grenades. Some carried white phosphorus grenades. They carried all they could bear, and then some, including a silent awe for the terrible power of the things they carried. In the first week of April, before Lavender died, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross received a good luck charm from Martha. It was a simple pebble, an ounce at most, smooth to the touch. It was a milky white color with flecks of orange and violet, oval-shaped like a miniature egg. In the accompanying letter, Martha wrote that she had found the pebble on the Jersey shoreline, precisely where the land touched water at high tide, where things come together but also separated. It was this separate but together quality, she wrote, that had inspired her to pick up the pebble and to carry it in her breast pocket for several days, where it seemed weightless, and then to send it through the mail by air as a token of her trusted feelings, of her truest feelings for him. Lieutenant Cross found this romantic, but he wondered what her truest feelings were exactly. And what she meant by separate but together. He wondered how the tides and waves had come into play on that afternoon along the Jersey shoreline when Martha saw the pebble and bent down to rescue it from geology. He imagined bare feet. Martha was a poet, with the poet's sensibilities, and her feet would be brown and bare, the toenails unpainted, the eyes chilly and somber like the ocean in March, and thought it was painful. He wondered who had been with her that afternoon. He imagined, but also separated. No, he imagined a pair of shadows moving along the strip of sand where things came together, but also separated. It was phantom jealousy, he knew, but he couldn't help himself. He loved her so much. On the march, through the hot days of early April, he carried the pebble in his mouth, turning it with his tongue, tasting sea salt and moisture. His mind wandered. He had difficulty keeping his attention on the war. On occasion, he would yell at his men to spread out the column, to keep walking barefoot along, to keep their eyes open. But then he would slip away into daydreams, just pretending walking barefoot along the Jersey shore with Martha, carrying nothing. He would feel himself rising, sun and waves and gentle winds, all love and lightness. What they carried varied by mission. When a mission took them to the mountains, They carried mosquito netting, matches, canvas tarps, and extra bug juice. Plug in my charger, so 1 minute. This might be a long excerpt, but trust me, this is worth it. I love it. It's gonna help. I hope. If it doesn't, I'm shit out of luck. Gonna eat real good after this too. Whoever you are, if you ever get to listen to this, you're listening to a moment in time where everything seems so difficult, yet it seems like it's meant exactly for me. Like an artist touching a canvas, like a writer writing a story. I hope in the end, Martha and Lieutenant Jimmy Cross are able to share with themselves feelings of love. The bottom says, rocket propelled grenades, military acronym slash slang, and that was for 8. Let me find that 1 second. 8. I know it was one of the hand grenades. Every soldier carried 3.5 with his firing device. M18. That's 2, 1. There it is, I think. Yes. AK-40 and Chi-Coms, and RPGs. That's that. Rocket-propelled grenades, military acronym slash saying, and RPG. That's awesome. I never knew that. RPG, rocket-propelled grenades. Leather-covered, often lead-filled clubs with flexible handles. And that is 9, which we found. That. Blackjacks. LAWs, light anti-tank or anti-armor weapons. Military acronym slash slang. Remote control mine. Yeah, that says remote control mine that fires steel balls. Maybe that's a claymore. That is, yeah, I found it. Yep, a claymore anti-personnel mine. The most common type of grenade, they fire small projectiles of fragments, and that is for 2. 2 is, wow, fragmentation grenades. All right, moving on to page from 628 to 629. Moving on from page 628 to 629. This is gonna be nice. If a mission seemed especially hazardous, or if it involved a place they knew to be bad, they carried everything they could. In certain heavily mined, I believe it says, AOs, where the land was dense with toe poppers and bouncing betties, they took turns humping a 28-pound mine detector with its headphones and big screening plate. The equipment was a stress on the lower back and shoulders. Awkward to any way. Partly for safety, partly for the illusion of safety. On ambush or other night missions, they carried peculiar little odds and ends. Kiowa always took along his New Testament and a pair of occasions? And a pair of moccasins for silence. Dave Jensen carried night sight vitamins, high in carotene. Actually beta carotene, but carotene. Lee Strunk carried his slingshot. Ammo, he claimed, would never be a problem. Little pebbles. Rat Kiley carried brandy and M&M candies. Until he was shot. Ted Lavender carried the Starlight Scope, which weighed 6.3 pounds with its aluminum carrying case. Aluminum carrying case. 6.7 pounds, I believe. Yep, 6.3 pounds, which weighed, the Starlight weighed 6.3 pounds with its aluminum carrying case. Henry Dobbins carried his girlfriend's pantyhose wrapped around his neck as a comforter. They all carried Ghost. When dark came, they would move out, single file across the meadows and paddies to the ambush coordinates. Remember, paddies are damp, usually fields for growing rice. To the ambush coordinates, where they would quietly set up claymores and lie down and spend the night waiting. Other missions were more complicated and required special equipment. In mid April, it was their mission to search out and destroy the elaborate tunneled complexes in the Tan K area south of Chu Lai. To blow the tunnels, they carried 1 pound blocks of penetrite high explosives, four blocks to a man, 68 pounds in all. They carried wiring, detonators, and battery powered clackers. Dave Jensen carried earplugs. Most often, before blowing the tunnels, they were ordered by higher command to search them, which was considered bad news. But by and large, they just shrugged and carried out orders. Because he was a big man, Henry Dobbins was excused from tunnel duty. The others would draw numbers. Before Lavender died, there were 17 men in the platoon, and whoever drew the number 17 would strip off his gear and crawl in head first. With a flashlight and Lieutenant Cross's 45 caliber pistol. The rest of them would fan out as security. They would sit down or kneel, not facing the hole, listening to the ground beneath them, imagining cobwebs and ghosts, whatever was down there, the tunnel walls squeezing in, how the flashlight seemed impossibly heavy in the hand, and how it was tunnel vision, in the very strictest sense, compression in all ways, even time, and how you had to wiggle in, ass and elbows, a swallowed up feeling, and how you found yourself worrying about odd things, and how you found yourself worrying about odd things. Will your flashlight go dead? Do rats carry rabies? If you screamed, how far would the sound carry? Would your buddies hear it? Would they have the courage to drag you out? In some respects, though not many, the waiting was worse than the tunnel itself. Imagination was a killer. On April 16, when Lee Strunk drew the number 17, he laughed and muttered something and went down quickly. The morning was hot and very still. Not good, Kiowa said. Before I finish the last line, it is continued on to the next page, so I'll just read the little, let's call them clarifications. Like toe poppers, slang for a type of landmine. AOs, areas of operations, military acronym / slang. Night vision device. During the war, a vast system of tunnels was constructed throughout South Vietnam as a stronghold and base for attacks. Some contained living areas, storage depots, even hospitals. Handheld firing devices for claymore mines. Battery-powered clockers was handheld firing devices for claymore mines. Again, this is 629 at the bottom, going on to the next page, so you won't hear me clarify, but it ends at, once you hear a dry, that's how you know I'm on to the next page, or next words will be for the next start of the next page. He looked at the tunnel opening, then out across a dry paddy toward the village of Tan K. Nothing moved, no clouds or birds or people. As they waited, the men smoked and drank Kool-Aid, not talking much, feeling sympathy for Lee Strunk, but also feeling the luck of the draw. You win some, you lose some, said Mitchell Sanders, and sometimes you settle for a rain check. It was a tired line, and no one laughed. Henry Dobbins ate a tropical chocolate bar. Ted Lavender popped a tranquilizer and went off to pee. After 5 minutes, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross moved to the tunnel, leaned down, and examined the darkness. Trouble, he thought. It cave in, maybe? And then suddenly, without willing it, he was thinking about Martha. The stresses and fractures, the quick collapse, the two of them buried alive under all that weight, dense, crushing love. Kneeling, watching the whole, he tried to concentrate on Lee Strunk and the war, all the dangers, but his love was too much for him. He felt paralyzed. He wanted to sleep inside her lungs and breathe her blood and be smothered. He wanted her to be a virgin and not a virgin, all at once. He wanted to know her intimate secrets. Why poetry? Why so sad? Why that grayness in her eyes? Why so alone? Not lonely, just alone, riding her bike across campus, or sitting off by herself in a cafeteria, even dancing. She danced alone, and it was the aloneness that filled him with love. He remembered telling her that one evening, how she nodded and looked away, and how she later, when he kissed her, she received the kiss without returning it, her eyes wide open, not afraid, not a virgin's eyes, just flat and uninvolved. Lieutenant Cross gazed at the tunnel, but he was not there. He was buried with Martha under the white sand at the Jersey shore. They were pressed together, and the pebble in his mouth was her tongue. He was smiling. Vaguely, he was aware of how quiet the day was. The Solon paddles, the Solon patties, yet he could not bring himself to worry about matters of security. He was beyond that. He was just a kid at war, in love. He was 24 years old. He couldn't help it. A few moments later, Lee Strunk crawled out of the tunnel. He came up grinning. Filthy, but alive. Lieutenant Cross nodded and closed his eyes while the others clapped Strunk on the back and made jokes about rising from the dead. Worms, Rat Kiley said. Right out of the grave. Fucking zombie. The men laughed. They all felt great relief. Spook City, said Mitchell Sanders. Lee Strunk made a funny ghost sound. Boo. A kind of moaning. Yet very happy, and right then, when Strunk made that high, happy moaning sound, when he went, oh, right then, Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. He lay with his mouth open. The teeth were broken. There was a swollen black bruise under his right eye. The cheekbone was gone. Oh shit, said Rat Kiley. Oh shit, Rat Kiley said. The guy's dead. The guy's dead, he kept saying, which seemed profound. The guy's dead. I mean, really. The tropical chocolate bar, for clarification purposes. Candy bar originally developed for the military in World War II, designed to withstand extreme heat. Ghost, but also used since the 1940s as a racial slur, especially with reference to African Americans. That's messed up. Anyways, proceeding on to the next page. From 3:30, 6:30, from 6:30 to 6:31. The lines do not connect, so this is the starting of a fresh sentence. The things they carried were determined to some extent by superstition. Lieutenant Cross carried his good luck pebble. Dave Jensen carried a rabbit's foot. Norman Bowler, otherwise a very gentle person, carried a thumb that had been presented to him as a gift by Mitchell Sanders. The thumb was dark brown, rubbery to the touch, and weighed 3 ounces at most. It had been cut from a VC corpse. A boy of 15 or 16. They found him at the bottom of an irrigation ditch, badly burned, flies in his mouth and eyes. The boy wore black shorts and sandals. At the time of his death, he had been carrying a pouch of rice, a rifle, and 3 magazines of ammunition. You rest in peace. You want my opinion? Mitchell Sanders said. There's a definite moral here. He put his hand on the dead boy's wrist. He was quiet for a time, as if counting a pulse. Then he patted the stomach, almost affectionately, and used Kiowa's hunting hatchet to remove the thumb. Henry Dobbins asked what the moral was. Moral? You know, moral. Sanders wrapped the thumb in toilet paper and handed it across to Norman Bowler. There was no blood. Smiling, he kicked the boy's head, watched the flies scatter, and said, "It's like with that old TV show Paladin. It's like with that old TV show Paladin. Have guns, have gun, will travel." Henry Dobbins thought about it. "Yeah, well," he finally said, "I don't see no moral." "There it is, man. Fuck off." They carried USO stationery and pencils and pens. They carried sterno, safety pins, trip flares, signal flares, spools of wire, razor blades, chewing tobacco, liberated jaw sticks, and statuettes of the smiling Buddha, candles, grease pencils, the stars and stripes, fingernail clippers, psyops, leaflets, bush hats, bolos, and much more. Twice a week, when the resupply choppers came in, they carried hot chow in green Murmurite cans and large canvas bags filled with ice beer and soda pop. They carried plastic water containers, each with a 2-gallon capacity. Mitchell Sanders carried a set of starched tiger fatigues for special occasions. Henry Dobbins carried Black Flag insecticide. Jabe Jensen carried empty sandbags that could be filled at night for added protection. Clarification at the end of 631 page. Viet Cong, military acronym / slang, remember, VC. Short for Vietnam Cong Son. Vietnam Cong Son, meaning Vietnamese communist. The guerrilla force that fought with the support of the North Vietnamese Army against both South Vietnam and the United States during the Vietnam War. Gunfighter protagonist of Have Gun, Will Travel, a popular television western, 1957 to 1963. Short for psychological operations, military operations designed to affect the mental state of opposing forces. USO, abbreviated and stands for United States Service Organizations, an acronym. Non-profit organization founded in 1941, providing programs, services, and entertainment to United States military personnel and their families. Sterno canned flammable jelly used as a portable heat source, usually for cooking. Trip flares, devices disturbed or tripped. Joss incense. Grease pencils, pencils made of colored grease. Usually used for writing on glossy surfaces. The Stars and Stripes, newspaper produced by the United States Department of Defense since World War II. Insulated aluminum canisters used to transport hot or cold meals to troops in the field. Camouflage uniform designed for jungle combat. That says 4. Starched tiger fatigues is a camouflage uniform designed for jungle combat. Again, 631, there's one, actually a proper noun, which is least drunk, and that proceeds on to the next page. It's not a finished sentence. Wouldn't even be considered a sentence, it's just a proper noun. But let's continue. So when I say least drunk, after that, anything that falls after that name is the start of 632. So it's a sentence at the bottom of 631, above the clarification, and continues on to page 632. Lee Strunk carried tanning lotion. Some things they carried in common. Taking turns, they carried the big PRC-77 scrambler radio, which weighed 30 pounds with its battery. They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer fear. What others no longer bear. Often they carried each other, the wounded or weak. They carried infections. They carried chess sets, basketballs, Vietnamese English dictionaries, insignia of rank, bronze stars and purple hearts, plastic cards imprinted with the code of conduct. They carried diseases, among them malaria and dysentery. They carried lice and ringworm, and leeches and patty algae, and various rots and molds. They carried the land itself, Vietnam, the place, the soil, a powdery, orange red dust that covered their boots and fatigues and faces. They carried the sky, the whole atmosphere. They carried it. The humidity, the monsoons, the stink of fungus and decay, all of it. They carried gravity. They moved like mules. By daylight, they took sniper fire. At night, they were mortared. But it was not battle. It was just the endless march, village to village, without purpose. Nothing won or lost. They marched for the sake of march. They marched for the sake of the march. They plodded along slowly, dumbly, leaning forward against the heat, unthinking, all blood and bone, simple grunts, soldiering with their legs, toiling up the hills, and down into the paddies, and across the rivers, and up again and down, just humping, one step, and then the next, and then another, but no volition, no will, because it was automatic. It was anatomy. And the war was entirely a matter of posture and carriage. The hump was everything, a kind of inertia, a kind of emptiness, a dullness of desire and intellect and conscience and hope, and human sensibility. Their principles were in their feet. Their calculations were biological. They had no sense of strategy or mission. They searched the villages without knowing what to look for, not caring, kicking over jars of rice, frisking children and old men, blowing tunnels, sometimes setting fires, and sometimes not, then forming up and moving on to the next village. Then other villages where it would always be the same. They carried their own lives. The pressures were enormous. In the heat of early afternoon, they would remove their helmets and flak jackets, walking bare, which was dangerous, but which helped ease the strain. They would often discard things along the route of march, purely for comfort. They would throw away rations, blow their claymores and grenades, no matter, because by nightfall, the resupply choppers would arrive with more of the same. Then a day or two later, still more. Fresh watermelons in crates of stunning, sparklers for the 4th of July, colored eggs for Easter. It was the great American war chest, the fruits of science, the smokestacks, the canneries, the arsenals at Hartford, the Minnesota forest, the machine shops, the vast fields of corn and wheat. They carried like freight trains. They carried it on their backs and shoulders. And for all the ambiguities of Vietnam, all the mysteries and unknowns, there was at least the single abiding certainty that they would never be at a loss for things to carry. After the chopper took Lavender away, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross led his men into the village of the Tan K. They burned everything. They shot chickens and dogs. They trashed the village well. They called in artillery and watched the wreckage. That they marched. Then they marched for several hours through the hot afternoon. Holy Spirit, rest in peace with dog and chickens. Then they marched for several hours, proceeding on to page 6 from 632, proceeding from 632, end of this line, to 631. Sorry. Continuing from page 632, which is where we're on, towards the bottom of the page, line 90, or no, 40, on to page 633. I'll start from the top of the sentence. They shot chickens and dogs. They trashed the village well. They called in artillery and watched the wreckage. And they marched for several hours through the hot afternoon. And then at dusk, start of page 633. Then at dusk, while Kiowa explained how Lavender died, Lieutenant Cross found himself trembling. He tried not to cry. With his entrenching tool, which weighed 5 pounds, he began digging a hole in the earth. He felt shame. He hated himself. He had loved Martha more than his men, and as a consequence, Lavender was now dead, and this was something he would have to carry like a stone in his stomach for the rest of the war. All he could do was dig. He used his entrenching tool like an axe, slashing, feeling both love and hate. And then later, when it was full dark, he sat at the bottom of his foxhole and wept. It went on for a long while. In part, he was grieving for Ted Lavender, but mostly it was for Martha and for himself, because she belonged to another world which was not quite real, and because she was a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey, a poet and a virgin and uninvolved, and because he realized she did not love him and never would. Like cement, Kiowa whispered in the dark. I swear to God. Boomed down, not a word. I've heard this, said Norman Booker. A pisser, you know, still zipping himself up, zapped while zipping. All right, fine, that's enough. Yeah, but you had to see it. The guy just, I heard, man. Cement. So why not shut the fuck up? Kiowa shook his head sadly and glanced over at the hole, where Lieutenant Jimmy Cross sat watching the night. The air was thick and wet. A warm, dense fog had settled over the paddies, and there was a stillness that precedes rain. After a time, Kiowa sighed. One thing for sure, he said. The lieutenant's in some deep hurt. I mean, that crying jag, the way he was carrying on, it wasn't fake or anything. It was real heavy-duty hurt. The man cares. Sure, Norman Booker said. Say what you want. The man does care. We all got problems. Not Lavender. No, I guess not, Booker said. Do me a favor, though. Shut up. Shut up? That's a smart Indian. Shut up. Shrugging, Kiowa put off his boots. He wanted to say more, just to lighten up his sleep. But instead he opened his New Testament and arranged it beneath his head as a pillow. The fog made things seem hollow and unattached. He tried not to think about Ted Lavender, but then he was thinking how fast it was, no drama, down and dead, and how it was hard to feel anything except surprise. It seemed unchristian. He wished he could find some great sadness or even anger, but the emotion wasn't there and he couldn't make it happen. Mostly, he felt pleased to be alive. He liked the smell of the New Testament under his cheek. The leather and ink and paper and glue, whatever the chemicals were. He liked hearing the sound of night, even his fatigue. It felt fine. The stiff muscles and the prickly awareness of his own body. A floating feeling. He enjoyed not being dead, lying there. Kiowa admitted. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, going on to page 634. Kiowa admitted Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, capacity for grief. He wanted to share the man's pain. He wanted to care as Jimmy Cross cared. And yet when he closed his eyes, all he could think was boom down. And all he could feel was the pleasure of having his boots off, and the fog curling in around him, and the damp soil, and the Bible smells, and the plush comfort of night. After a moment, Norman Booker sat up in the dark. "What the hell?" he said. "You want to talk? Talk? Tell it to me." "Forget it." "No, man. Go. No, man. No, man. Go on. One thing I hate, it's a silent Indian." For the most part, they carried themselves with poise, a kind of dignity. Now and then, however, there were times of panic, when they squealed or wanted to squeal but couldn't, when they twitched and made moaning sounds, and covered their heads and said, "Dear Jesus," and flopped around on the earth, and fired their weapons blindly, and cringed and sobbed and begged for the noise to stop, and went wild and made stupid promises to themselves and to God and to their mothers and fathers, hoping not to die. In different ways, it happened to all of them. Afterward, when the firing ended, they would blink and peek up. They would touch their bodies, feeling shame, then quickly hiding it. They would force themselves to stand, as if in slow motion, frame by frame. They would take on the old logic, absolute silence, then the wind, then sunlight, then voices. It was the burden of being alive. Awkwardly, the men would reassemble themselves, first in private, then in groups, becoming soldiers again. They would repair the leaks. They would repair the leaks in their eyes. They would check for casualties, call in dust-offs, light cigarettes, try to smile, clear their throats and spit, and begin cleaning their weapons. After a time, someone would shake his head and say, "No lie, I almost shit my pants." And someone else would laugh, which meant it was bad, yes. But the guy had obviously not shit his pants. It wasn't that bad. And in any case, nobody would ever do such a thing and then go ahead and talk about it. They would squint into the dense, oppressive sunlight for a few moments. Perhaps they would fall silent, lighting a joint and tracking its progress, and tracking its passage from man to man, inhaling, holding in the humiliation. "Scary stuff," one of them might say, but then someone else would grin or flick his eyebrows and say, "Roger, Roger, Roger Dodger, almost cut me a new asshole almost." "Scary stuff," one of them might say, but then someone else would grin or flick his eyebrows and say, "Roger Dodger, almost cut me a new asshole almost." There were numerous such poses. Some carried themselves with a sort of wistful resignation, others with pride or stiff solidarity, discipline or good humor or macho zeal. They were afraid of dying, but they were even more afraid to show it. They found jokes to tell. They used a hard vocabulary to contain the terrible softness. Greased, they'd say. Oft, lit up, zapped while zipping. It wasn't cruelty, just stage presence. They were actors. When someone died, it wasn't quite dying, because in a curious way it seemed scripted. And because they had their lines mostly memorized, irony mixed with tragedy, and because they called it by other names, as if to insist and destroy the reality of death itself. They kicked corpses. They cut off thumbs. They talked grunt lingo. They told stories about Ted Lavender's supply of tranquilizers, how the poor guy didn't feel a thing, how incredibly tranquil he was. Moving on to page 635. Start of a fresh sentence. There's a moral here. There's a moral here, said Mitchell Sanders. They were waiting for Lavender's chopper, smoking the dead man's dope. The moral's pretty obvious, Sanders said, and winked. Stay away from drugs. No joke. They will ruin your day every time. Cute, said Henry Dobbins. Mind blower. Get it? Talk about Wiggy. Nothing left, just blood and brains. They made themselves laugh. There it is, they'd say, over and over. There it is, my friend. There it is. As if the repetition itself was an act of poise. A balance between crazy and almost crazy. Knowing without going. There it is. Which meant be cool. Let it ride. Because oh yeah, man, you can't change what can't be changed. There it is. There it absolutely and positively and fucking well is. They were tough. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die: grief, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles. But the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run off, to run or freeze or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all. They carried the reputations. They carried the soldiers' greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They died so as not to die of embarrassment. They crawled into tunnels and walked point and advanced under fire. Each morning, despite the unknowns, they made their legs move. They endured. They kept humping. They kept humping. They did not submit to the obvious alternative, which was simply to close the eyes and fall. So easy, really. Go limp and tumble to the ground and let the muscles unwind and not speak and not budge until your buddies picked you up and lifted you into the chopper that would roar and dip its nose and carry you off to the world. A mere matter of falling. Yet no one ever fell. It was not courage, exactly. The object was not valor. Rather, they were too frightened to be cowards. By and large, they carried these things inside, maintaining the mask of composure. They sneered at sick call. They spoke bitterly about guys who had found release by shooting off their toes or fingers. Pussies, they say. Candy asses. It was fierce, mocking talk, with only a trace of envy or awe. But even so, the image played itself out behind their eyes. They imagined the muzzle against flesh, so easy. Squeeze the trigger and blow away a toe. They imagined it. They imagined the quick, sweet pain. Then the evacuation to Japan. Then a hospital with warm beds and cute geisha nurses. And they dreamed of freedom birds. At night, on guard, staring into the dark, they were carried away by jumbo jets. They felt the rush of takeoff. Gone, they yelled. And then velocity, wings and engines, a smiling stewardess. But it was more than a plane. It was a real bird. A big, sleek silver bird with feathers and talons and high screeching. They were flying. The weights fell off. There was nothing to hear. They laughed and held on tight, feeling the cold slap of wind and altitude. Soaring. Thinking it's, proceeding to the next page, 637. Thinking it's over. I'm gone. They were naked. They were light and free. It was all lightness, bright and fast and buoyant. Light as light, a helium buzz in the brain, a giddy bubbling in the lungs as they were taken up over the clouds and the war beyond duty, beyond gravity and modification and global entanglements. Sinaloa. I want to say Sinaloa. They yelled, I'm sorry, motherfuckers, but I'm out of it. I'm goofed. I'm on a space cruise. I'm gone. And it was a restful, unencumbered sensation. just riding the light waves, sailing the big silver freedom bird over the mountains and oceans, over and the golden eight arches of McDonald's. It was flight, a kind of fleeing, a kind of falling, falling higher and higher, spinning off the edge of the earth and beyond the sun and through the vast, silent vacuum where there were no burdens and where everyone's weighed exactly nothing. Gone, they screamed. I'm sorry, but I'm gone. And so at night, not quite dreaming, they gave themselves over to lightness. They were carried, they were purely born. On the morning after Ted Lavender died, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross crouched at the bottom of his foxhole and burned Martha's letters. Then he burned the 2 photographs. There was a steady rain falling, which made it difficult, but he used heat tabs and sterno to build a small fire, screening it with his body, holding the photographs over the tight blue flame with the tips of his fingers. He realized it was only a gesture. Stupid, he thought. Sentimental too, but mostly just stupid. Lavender was dead. You couldn't burn the flame. You couldn't burn the blame. Lieutenant Cross could see Martha playing volleyball in her white gym shorts and yellow t-shirt. He could see her moving in the rain. When the fire died out, Lieutenant Cross pulled his poncho over his shoulders and ate breakfast from a can. There was no great mystery, he decided. In those burned letters, Martha had never mentioned the war, except to say, Jimmy, take care of yourself. She wasn't involved. She signed the letters love, but it wasn't love, and all the fine letters and technicalities did not matter. Virginity was no longer an issue. He hated her. Yes, he did. He hated her. Love, too. But it was hard. But it was a hard, hating kind of love. The morning came up, wet and blurry. Everything seemed part of everything else. The fog and Martha and deepening rain. He was a soldier after all. Half smiling, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross took out his maps. He shook his head hard, as if to clear it, then bent forward and began planning the day's march. In 10 minutes, or maybe 20, he would rouse the men, and they would pack up and head west, where the map showed the country to be green and inviting. They would do what they had always done. The rain might add some weight, but otherwise it would be no more. It would be one more day layered upon all the other days. He was realistic about it. There was that new hardness in his stomach. He loved her, but he hated her. Sorry or excuse me, Vietnamese, Sin Lo, or LOI, Sin Loi. Sorry or excuse me, in Vietnamese. Proceeding to the next page, brand new line. Final page. No more fantasies, he told himself. Henceforth, when he thought about Martha, it would only be to think about it would be only to think that she belonged elsewhere. He would shut down daydreams. This was not Mount Sebastian. It was another world where there were no pretty poems or midterm exams, a place where men died because of carelessness and gross stupidity. Kiowa was right. Boom doom. And you were dead. Never partly dead. Briefly in the rain, Lieutenant Cross saw Martha's gray eyes gazing back at him. He understood. It was very sad, he thought. The things men carried inside. The things men did or felt they had to do. He almost nodded at her, but didn't. Instead, he went back to his maps. He was now determined to perform his duties firmly and without negligence. It wouldn't help Lavender. He knew that. But from this point on, he would comport himself as an officer. He would dispose of his good luck pebble, swallow it maybe, or use Lee's strung slingshot, or just drop it along the trail. On the march, he would impose strict field discipline. He would be careful to send out flank security to prevent straggling or bunching up, to keep his troops moving at the proper pace and the proper interval. He would insist on clean weapons. He would confiscate the remainder of Lavender's dope. Later in the day, perhaps, he would call the men together. He would call the men together and speak to them plainly. He would accept the blame for what had happened to Ted Lavender. He would be a man about it. He would look them in the eyes, keeping his chin level, and he would issue the new SOP, Standard Operating Procedures, in a calm, impersonal tone of voice, a lieutenant's voice, leaving no room for argument or discussion. Connecting immediately, he'd tell them. They would no longer abandon equipment along the route of march. They would police up their acts. They would get their shit together and keep it together and maintain it neatly and in good working order. He would not tolerate laxity. He would show strength, distancing himself. Among the men, there would be grumbling, of course, and maybe worse, because their days would seem longer and their loads heavier. But Lieutenant Jimmy Cross reminded himself that his obligation was not to be loved, but to lead. He would dispense with love. It was not now a factor. And if anyone quarreled or complained, he would simply tighten his lips, arrange his shoulders to the correct command posture. He might give a curt little nod, or he might not. He might just shrug and say, "Carry on." Then they would saddle up and form into a column and move out toward the villages west of 10K. 1986 to 1990.